all caught up to where we are holding with the Amud Yomi. We are at the bottom of Testament Aleph, going on to Testament Beis, talking about some tragic sugyas, about the destruction of the first and second Beis Hamikdash, and what the reasons were for all of those things. And it begins 5 lines from the end of Testament Aleph, towards the end of the line, Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta. We're going to come back to this price a number of times throughout the next Amud. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta, Mipnei ma charva Shilai. What was the reason that Shiloh was destroyed? After we discussed the Kohanim Gedolim, the second Beis Hamikdash, so we'll see that problems with Kohanim did not just start then. It was an ancient problem. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta asked the question, what was the reason that Shiloh was destroyed? Says the Gemara, Mipnei shehayu ba shnei dvarim, because of 2 problems: Gila arayis or bizyan gachim, sexual immorality, and desecration, denigration of karbanos. What exactly does that mean? So Gila arayis, what were the Gila arayis? The pasuk says ve'eli zaken me'od, that the Kohen Gadol Eli was very old. V'shama es kol asher yasun banot l'chol Yisrael, and he heard about what his sons had done to the Jewish people. And that they had slept with the women that were gathered at the front of the tent. Sounds bizarre. The sons of the Kohen Gadol would be doing such a thing, says the Gemara. Even though Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, anybody that says that the pshat in the pasuk is like it sounds, that they actually slept with these women, is totally mistaken. That's not what happened. That's not pshat in the pasuk. But because turning on to Testament of the Beis, Shisho is kinehem, that they took their time in bringing the karbanos, the pairs of birds that the Yoldos had to bring. The Torah considers as if they slept with them. What does it mean as if they slept with them? Because they prevented them from being intimate with their husbands. Meaning, because the sons of Eli didn't deal with those karbanos in a right amount of time, it meant that those women couldn't become the taharas, and since they couldn't finish the tahara process, they couldn't go to the mikveh, they couldn't be with their husbands, so they were depriving intimacy from those couples. And it's as if they had slept with them, meaning because they prevented them from having intimacy with other people. So what's the bizyon kachim? Bizyon kachim dichsev gam beterem yaktirin esachelev, even before the chelev was offered, meaning the part of the korban that had to go on the mizbech. Uvan nar hakohen, and came along the nar of the kohen, that is the attendant, the servant of the kohen. Va'amar leisha zvech, and said to the person that had brought the korban, tzana basar litzlois lekohen, give meat. Give the meat for the kohen to roast. And he's not going to take cooked meat from you. He wants to take right now. He wants to take it raw. He wants to be able to roast it. And if the man would say to him, first go finish your job, put the chelev onto the mizbech, and then come and take as much as you want. V'amar would say, no, give it to me now. And if not, I'll take it myself. They would take a big pitchfork and stick it into the pot and take whatever he wanted. And the sin of these attendants of the Ghanim was immense. In other words, the pasuk says, because they made this whole thing of karbanos into some kind of exchange of fleishiks, and that made it not a karban-related event connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was also pashas. It was also gzela. Because the Kohanim are given chazak and shaik, they're given the breast and the thigh of the animal. But these narim of the Kohanim would come and they would say, either give us what we want or we'll take whatever we want, and they would stick the thing and take whatever they wanted. So not only was it a problem of denigrating kachim, but they were also practically stealing from the balim that were entitled to eat the rest of the korban. And now the Gemara returns back to the conversation about why the Bate Migdash were destroyed. So we saw Shiloh was destroyed because of the sins of the sons of the sons of Eli, and now this is a famous Gemara. Although there are different versions of this Gemara in different places, and the Rishonim and Acharonim deal with the discrepancies. This is the famous one. Mikdash Rishon mipnei ma'acharav. What was the first place that Mikdash was destroyed for? Mipnei gimel dvarim, because of three things. Shayu by avodah zarah, v'gil arayis, v'shichas dam. The big three: idol worship, sexual immorality, and murder. How do you know that these three things existed? Avodah zarah, avodah zarah we know about. Dichsiv, the pasuk says, pasuk in Yeshayahu, ki katzar hamatzah mehishtare'a. The bed is too short for a person to stretch himself out. So what does this mean? The bed is too short for a person to stretch himself out. My katzar matzah mehishtareya. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, katzar matzah zeh mehishtarer alav shnei reim ke'echad. This bed is not big enough for the both of us, effectively. Meaning, the Jewish people is like is the kala of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we are, so to speak, in bed with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then we introduced something else into that bed, and that's called avodah zarah. And the pasuk, the Navi is saying, this bed is not big enough for the both of us, meaning to have HaKadosh Baruch Hu and avodah zarah in the bed together. And that's the lashon mehishtareya. Shtei reim. That's how the Rishonim point out here. Meaning mehishtareya, to stretch out, means shtei reim ke'echad. V'amasecha tzara kehis naches, and the covering is too narrow to be covered up with. Amar Shmuel Rechmeni. So what does that at the end of the pasuk mean? Kimate Rabbi Yochanan lahayikra. When Rabbi Yochanan came to this pasuk, Bachi, he would start crying. Amar, he said, Man dichsiv bei kaned mei hayam. The Rebbeinu Shalom, about who it says that he gathers together the waters of the sea in a pile, meaning because he split the sea, he made the waters pile up in the sea. Naas is like masecha tzara, a masecha, a clump of stone of an idol has now become like a co-wife, a tzara, meaning he has to compete now with something that is totally irrelevant, and that's the lashon masecha tzara me his kanes masecha. It's a play on words. Masecha means a cover, but it also means Elohei Masecha, gods of graven images. Tzara, not tzara as in narrow, but tzara as in a co-wife. Hisnaches, from the one that is koines kaned me hayam. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is now in competition with avodah zarah, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan was crying. So Gila Arayis, how do you know that Gila Arayis existed in the days of the first Beis Hamikdash? The pasuk says, "Vayomer Hashem said, Yan ki gavu b'nos Tzion, because the daughters of Tzion have become haughty. V'teilachna nitiyos garon, and they walk with their necks stretched out. Umesakros einayim, and with curious eyes, or with gazing eyes. They walk tatof, which we'll explain in a minute. And with their feet, te'achasna, they do something that we'll see is angering or poisonous with their feet. What's this poison with their feet? So now the pasuk explains: Yan ki gavu b'nos Tzion, the daughters of Tzion are haughty. Shayu mehalchos arucha b'tzad katzara. They would the tall ones would intentionally go walk next to the short ones so that they could highlight the fact that they were tall. And they went with stretch out necks. They walked in a very upright posture, displaying their figures. That they would stare with their eyes. What do they do with the eyes? They would do their eyes up with fancy makeup. And they would walk in a tataf, like in a mincing way. What does that mean? That they would walk with the heel touching the toe, meaning that they wouldn't walk one foot next to the other. They would put literally one foot in front of the other, and that would make them sway and move in an attractive way. And with their feet, they would do something te'achasna. What is te'achasna? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak shemivios mur va'afar simon. They would bring myrrh and afar simon and balsam. Umenichas b'man aleihem, and they would put it into their shoes. When they would come to young Jewish men, batas, they would kick. Umatiz aleihem, and they would spray them with perfume. And they would induce into these young men a yetzara like the poison of a snake. So where is the Gil Arai? So Rashi points out in Maseches Shabbos, because these were not single girls; these were the married women that were doing this. They were looking for young men to hang out with, and that this was the Gil Arai of the first Beis Hamikdash. Shvichus damim. How do you know that there was murder? Shvichus damim dichsev v'gam dam naki shavach Menashe, because Menashe also murdered innocent people. Harbei me'od, many innocent people. Ad asher milei Yerushalayim peh lepeh, until Yerushalayim was filled from one side to the other. The pasuk in Malachim, that Yerushalayim was filled from one side to the other with all of these murders. So you see that there was Gil Arai, Shvichus damim, and Avodah Zarah. Back to Rabbi Yochanan ben Tarta, explaining what about the second Beis Hamikdash. Aval Migdash Sheni shayu osuk b'Torah mitzvahs ugmilas chasadim. Migdash Sheni, they were all tzaddikim. They learned Torah, they did mitzvahs, they engaged in chesed. Mibnei ma charav. Why was the second Beis Hamikdash destroyed? Mibnei shayu by sinas chinam. This is the famous line of the Gemara, which is very appropriate now, as we are on our way to Chag HaShavos, trying to fix up the lack of Avos Yisrael that existed between the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. So, because there was hatred that was for nothing. Baseless hatred, which we've noted many times before in other shiurim. Everybody thinks that their sinah is not chinam. Now, all sinah is chinam, unless it's the sinah that the Torah says you're supposed to have. This is the part that they don't tell you when they quote this line, but it tells you that sinas chinam is as bad as those three averos. Avodah Zarah, Gil Arai, Shvichus damim. Says the Gemara, Rishayim hayu, they were wicked people. And in the first Beis Hamikdash, they were wicked, they were big Rishayim, but they trusted in Hashem. Also in Mikdash Rishon, and that refers to the first Beis Hamikdash. The pasuk says, "Rosha b'sheichad yishpaitu b'ka'anecha b'mchir yaru v'nviyah b'kesav yiksomu." The heads would judge with bribery, and the Kohanim would teach only for pay, and the prophets would do sorcery for money. But they still leaned on Hashem, saying, "Haloi Hashem b'kirenu." The Rebbeinu Shalom is with us. Nothing bad will come to us. Meaning, they were Rishayim, but they believed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was with them. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu punished them with 3 gezeros. And so what does it mean? Because they trusted in Hashem, Hashem punished them with 3 averos. It means that since they trusted in HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked at each of those 3 averos as separate averos. Because it wasn't that they were apikarsim. They were not apikarsim. They believed in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they did 3 really big averos. It wasn't that they abandoned HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They believed in Hashem. They had a yetzara, and they did all these terrible things. But they believed in Hashem, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu punished them for these 3 averos. Can I give my averos in terrible ways? Can I give my averos of Yadam? Shneim the pasuk says, "Lachem b'gilalchem tzion sadet techaresh Yerushalayim tiyeh v'har habayis lebamos yar." Because of you, Tzion is going to be plowed like a field, and Yerushalayim is going to become like heaps. V'har habayis lebamos yar, and the mountain of Hashem is going to be like lebamos yar is going to be like a forest. Mikdash Rishon, those are the 3 punishments. Mikdash Rishon, and the Gemara challenges what? First Beis Hamikdash. Is it really true that there was no sinas chinam? Vaksiv in the pasuk say, "Migurei el cherev hayu es ami." Migurei El, these brave people, or these terrifying people, Migurei El, Cherev Hayu Esami, they pointed a sword at my people. Lachen Sipuk Al Yorich, therefore, um, I'll smite them on my thigh. Amar Rabbi Elazar. This is referring to people that eat together with each other, but they stab each other with their tongues, meaning they use their words to do serious damage. So clearly they had sinas chinam. They had sinas chinam issues in the first place. English says the Gemara, no. This was only speaking about the leaders, the princes. Zak vehelel ben Adam. Cry out and wail, son of man. This was in my nation. What's been in my nation? Vitanya, and the Brisa says, Zak vehelel ben Adam. Cry out and wail, son of man. Yachol lakol, for everybody. For everybody, no. Talmud Laimar, he bechol nesiy. This is talking about all the princes of the Jewish people, but not everybody else. Meaning, the leadership hated each other, but the rest of the Jewish people that were engaged in lots of affairs, but they didn't have any problems with each other. Rabbi Yochanan ve Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both say, Rishonim sheniskalo avaynam niskalo kitzam. The first ones, the first Beis Hamikdash, that their sins were revealed, they were out in the open, niskalo kitzam. The end of their galus was also revealed. It was only going to be 70 years. The Achronim, that their sins were not revealed, their end was not has not been revealed. That's us. We are still in galus. We don't yet have the Geula Shlema, even though tonight is Yom Yerushalayim. We are not zeichet to the Geula Shlema quite yet, because apparently we haven't fixed up the sin of Leniskala Avainam. We've learned this piece in Rav Kook before. That Rav Kook explains what does it mean is Gala Avainam, that their sins were only external to them, which tracks with the beginning of the Gemara. Their sins were external to them, as opposed to in the second Beis Hamikdash, externally they were good, but their sins were identity based. They didn't consider themselves or other people as part of Klal Yisrael, and that was the Avera. So until we figure out reuniting our identity with Jewish identity, that would not be the full kapara of Niskala Avainam. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Yochanan, Tavet Tziparin Shal Rishonim, B'Kreisei Shal Achronim. The fingernail of the earlier generations is better than the belly of the later generations, meaning a tiny drop from the earlier generations is much greater than the greatest of the later generations. No, on the contrary, the later generations are better. Even though we are in Galus, the Shibud Malchus, we're still learning Torah. Amarle, so Rabbi Yochanan says to him, yeah, you're right, but the Beis Hamikdash will prove it. The Beis Hamikdash proves it, that the Beis Hamikdash came back for the first ones, but it didn't come back for the second ones. Apparently, Torah is not enough. The fact that we learn Torah and we're good from it is not enough, says Rabbi Yochanan. Shalu es Rabbi Elazar. They asked the question of Rabbi Elazar, who's better? The first, the earlier generations, the later generations. Amar lahem, so he says, take a look at the Beis Hamikdash. The days of the first Beis Hamikdash, only the roof was burnt down. The second Beis Hamikdash, the whole thing was burnt down. And then Ikadamri, there are those that said, Amar lahem, he said to them, Eidechem Bira. The Beis Hamikdash is its own testimony, meaning, did it come back yet? It came back for the first ones, for the first Beis Hamikdash that was built. They came back for the second Beis Hamikdash. But the second Beis Hamikdash has not yet been rebuilt. It seems to imply that the first generation, even with the Gila Rice and the Shrichas Dam and the Avodah Zarah, that they were greater than the second Beis Hamikdash. Rish Lakish Havasachi be Yardena. Rish Lakish was going for a swim in the Yarden River. Also, Rabbi Bar Chana came along Rabbi Bar Chana. Yavle Yada, and he stuck at his hand to him. Amarle, and Rish Lakish says to him, Elaka Senena Lechu. God hates you, or by God I hate you. One of the other. Why? Dichsiv im chaymahi. The pasuk says in Shir Hashirim, if it will be like a wall, nivna ala tiras kasef. We'll build a tower of silver on it. Vim delasi, and if it's a door, natzur ala loach aris. We'll put up boards of cedar. Which means, if you, the Jewish people, made yourselves like a wall, and you all came back to Eretz Yisrael in the days of Ezra, you would have been compared to silver. That does not decay, there's no rot in silver. Now that there's been a trickle, a drip, a drab of aliyah from the days of Ezra, and people haven't come back. This has already been hundreds of years, says Rish Lakish. Nimshaltim keres, it's like wood, like cedar wood, which ends up that ends up rotting. Ma eres. So what is the cedar wood? Amar Ula sas magar. It's called sas magar. My sas magar, and what is sas magar? Amar Rabbi Abba baskol. It means a baskol, meaning that there's still some value to it. There's still some value to it, but we haven't had the return of Nevuah, which seems to mean that the return of Nevuah is, the prerequisite for that is the return of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael, not just in drips and drabs, but en masse. Kedetanya, as it was taught in the Brisa, Mishimesi Nevi'im Achronim, after the death of the final Nevi'im, which is Chag, Zechariah, Malachi, those three final Nevi'im, Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh Yisrael, Ruach HaKodesh left the Jewish people, which that's not the same thing as Nevuah, but they were still using a baskol. Does that mean that Ruach HaKodesh doesn't exist today? That's a big machlekes. But they would still use a baskol. Baskol still existed. That was the sas magar. That Loach Ares was not the full return of Nevuah and Hashras HaShechina. It was something of a shadow of it. But they would still use the baskol. And then the Gemara asks an important historical question about Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, in general, didn't have conversations with people outside of the Beis Medrash, because once upon a time, he was, Reish Lakish literally means head highwayman. And once he became a Baal Tshuva, he was very careful about not talking to people outside in the streets so as not to be associated with the wrong people. And now the Gemara questions: would Reish Lakish really been having a conversation with Rabbi Bar Chana? Uma Rabbi Lazar, the Ardi Yisrael have. But even Rabbi Lazar, who was the Marda Asher of Eretz Yisrael, Reish Lakish did not have conversations with him. He didn't go schmoozing with him. And we had a principle in the days of Reish Lakish that anybody that Reish Lakish ever spoke to in the shuk, people would do business with that person without witnesses, because Reish Lakish was so careful not to talk to anybody. If he did speak to somebody, it meant that the person was such a stellar, upstanding character. Reish Lakish didn't talk to anybody. It didn't make sense that he would have been having a conversation with Rabbi Bar Chana. Not Papa said, "Shadi Gavra B'nai." No. Other was Reish Lakish with Zeiri, who was unique in that Reish Lakish would speak to him. Zeiri was a fascinating, unique character that Reish Lakish felt comfortable speaking to him. He was beyond reproach. Or Rabbi Bar Chana, or the story was not really Reish Lakish; it was a story between Rabbi Bar Chana and Rabbi Lazar. Meaning Rabbi Bar Chana was the Babylonian, and Rabbi Lazar was the person swimming. Interesting to note. What the Gemara is saying in the first version of this is that Reish Lakish was looking at Zeiri, who he thought was on the madrega that he would be able to speak to him outside the Beis Medrash, and says, "Hashem hates you for living in Chutz La'aretz." Okay, says the Gemara. Ki ata lekam de Rabbi Yochanan, when they came in front of Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Le, he said to them, "Lav hayin taima." He said back to Reish Lakish, "You're wrong. That's not the reason that the Beis Hamikdash didn't return in its full glory, and the Ashar Shechina and the Mikdash didn't come with Nevuah. You're wrong. It's not because Klal Yisrael didn't come up." He says, "Inami silku kulu b'mei Ezra." Even if everybody did come up in the days of Ezra, the Beis Hamikdash would not have rested in the Beis Hamikdash, the second Beis Hamikdash. Why? The pasuk says, "Yaft Elokim leyefes v'yishkem ba'alei Shem." Because Baruch Hu says that Yefes becomes beautiful. The Bnei Yefes become beautiful, v'yishkem ba'al Hashem, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence only rests in the tents of Shem. Turning to Yud Amud Aleph, Af al Gav the Yaft Elokim Yefes, even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu says Yefes gets beauty, which is Persia, in the days of Cyrus the Great, Rashi says, "Shizachu parsim livnos ba'isheni." Ein hashchina sherer el ba'alei shem. It can only rest in the alei shem, in the tents of Shem, if it was built by Klal Yisrael. And Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, we will continue tomorrow with understanding how we know that the Parasim came from Yefes, and everybody should have a Freilichen Yom Yerushalayim. We should be Zoche to see the Geula Shlema Amitis Bimher B'Amenu for us and for all of Klal Yisrael. Have a wonderful evening.